Do you remember growing your first $900 tomato and thinking, gosh, if I just had gone to the grocery store, it would have been way cheaper? Yeah, same. But we are not doing that anymore. Welcome to the Food, Farm, and Finance Podcast. I'm your host, Austin Graff, and together we are going to build our farms, homesteads, and gardens without destroying our finances. So let's get that bag of soil and money. Welcome to another episode of the Food, Farm, and Finance Podcast. I am your host, Austin Graff, creator and founder of Buzz Blooms, which means nothing to you because you probably don't know me from Adam. But today we are talking about raised bed gardening and how to make it more affordable. All right, so if you don't know anything about this podcast, Food, Farm, and Finance is a podcast that is designed to make gardening, farming, homesteading more affordable and more economical for the average person. All right, so we want it to be accessible for everyone. So we're sharing information, tips, tricks to make sure it is budget friendly so that we can build our farms, gardens, and homestead dreams without destroying our finances too. All right, so let's get into it. Raised bed gardening. Raised bed gardening is expensive, okay? I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It doesn't have to be, but oftentimes it is. Let's just honestly talk about why people get into raised bed gardening. But before we do that, let's do a little message from today's sponsors. And today's sponsor is nobody because I am wildly unpopular. But once again, I want you to know that at some point in my career trajectory, there will be a sponsor right here in this little time slot. And at that point, I want you to support the crap out of them so that I can keep this wildly accessible and free to everyone. Supporting me hopefully supports the flow of positive and amazing information. And maybe this episode is not that because I am still learning and trying, but we'll get there. Now, without further ado, let's talk about raised bed gardening. I've really got to stop singing in my podcast, but I mean, let's just face it. This voice was built for opera, okay? 10 out of 10. So why might people be interested in raised bed gardening? First and foremost, let's be real. It's cute. She adorable. But that's not really a good enough reason. I know that every middle-aged woman this side of the Mississippi has a Pinterest board with a raised bed gardening on it. It doesn't matter if she is a city slicker. It does not matter if she is country as country gets. There is a raised bed garden in that Pinterest profile, and she might not even like plants. She just is like, I want that. It's going to be adorable. Let's hang some twinkle lights above it. So, yes, raised bed gardening, beautiful, absolutely adorable. But people go way too overboard. Like, this can be a part of your landscaping. I accept that. And if you want something pretty and frilly and gorgeous, okay, that's fine. I do also accept that. But let's try and stay on budget with this, my friends. All right, so that is not the only reason we are raised bed gardening. There are actually some very beneficial reasons that you might want to consider by raised bed gardening, okay? So number one is drainage. So raised bed gardening, it really gains popularity for the purpose of drainage. Someone like me, I live in a very heavy clay soil area. So what happens is if we put out a garden straight into the ground during different times of that year, the clay is going to act differently. Sometimes the clay is going to get so brittle and so hard that it doesn't let water even absorb. Sometimes it's going to hold that water in a puddle. It's a big clay thing, you know? So raised bed gardening helps make sure that the water in that garden bed really drains out really nicely. And what that's going to do is it's going to keep your plant feet from being wet. So most plants, not all, because there are water-loving plants, but most plants that we're growing in our garden do not like to have wet roots. So they love to have a period of time where the roots kind of dry out, and then they get more moisture, they dry out, they get more moisture. They don't want to just sit in a puddle, all right? Have you ever been standing around in boots that are soaked, and by the end of the day, your feet are raw and just unhappy? Same thing happens with your plant roots. So by choosing raised bed gardens, we can really help improve that drainage because that water is going to come in and flow out. So the plant will uptake all that it needs, and then all the excess is going to drain far away, all right? A universe far away. Let's get some Star Wars vibes in the mix. Um, Also, it's more accessible, okay? And as someone who had an abdominal surgery that wiped my little butt out, and now I have permanent nerve damage, which is a real treat, I must say, having my garden be more accessible in terms of physically accessible has really been amazing. So I really love that my garden beds are 17 inches off the ground. So it's a lot easier on my body to kind of make that bend instead of going all the way down to the ground. This is a lot better for me. So much more accessible, easier on the body, great as you age, right? So, and let me just tell you, there is not a day that goes by that I do not feel older and older and older. And I'm not even 30 yet, but whoo, it is encroaching on me. All right, it's feeling rough out here. With that said, also less weed pressure. I find raised beds, the soil is much lighter, looser, loamier. So what weeds there are just pull out so much easier. And because you have literally soil that is like way above the ground level and you've added your different amendments to it, you're going to have a lot less weed pressure there naturally. So you can just bloop out the weeds, which is also a critical part of it being more accessible and easier on your body, because weeding is difficult work, all right? It is not easy to weed a garden, not even close. And just overall, the maintenance of raised beds can be a lot easier to stay on top of as well. So that is just a few reasons why you might consider raised bed gardening. There are loads of other reasons, right? But these are just a few that really stick out to me. And for me, my favorite is the improved drainage, because like I said, I have clay soil. Like, it is thick out here, all right? Like, you could spit on the ground and it would pond up. It's just no joke. All right. So with that said, we know that we want raised beds. We know that they can be great, beneficial, easier on our bodies. They can be great for the plants, but how do we go about it? How do we afford it? Because when you look at the raised bed options online, it's very common for a metal raised bed to be hundreds of dollars. Wooden raised beds can be even more than that, hundreds of dollars. And they are just frankly not super cheap. So I do not want you to necessarily go out and spend thousands of dollars on raised beds, unless that's something you, of course, want to do and that's something you're willing to make the investment in. What I will say is a lot of those metal raised beds that you see online that do cost a lot of money literally will last 20 plus years. So, if you're kind of like depreciating that asset, you can literally bank on that $300 that you spend on that raised bed is going to be distributed out over 20 years of that bed. So if that's something you're willing to make the investment in, I don't necessarily think that's bad, but there are cheaper ways of doing things. So let's start off with probably the cheapest, most common way of building out raised beds. It would be reclaimed wood. Obviously, I mean, wood is everywhere. There on my property is at least like tons and tons of reclaimed barn wood that's just everywhere. And I don't know if I'm a hoarder or if it just came with the property. I don't know how I get it, but it's just, there's so much and it's just everywhere. It's truly a wonderful blessing to have. But there are a few things you need to look at when you're choosing reclaimed wood. And the biggest thing is you're looking for non-pressure treated wood. Okay, I cannot stress this enough. Now, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty sciencey pieces of pressure treated wood and gardening, but long story short, there are some potential hazards by using pressure treated wood, and I am just not about that life, right? The goal of us having a garden is to build a healthier lifestyle, to eat better, higher quality vegetables for cheaper. And the idea of using pressure treated wood that could potentially leak harmful chemicals into my food, which, let's be real, harmful chemicals in food is an issue pretty much anywhere, but I'm not trying to actively pursue that, right? So skip on the pressure treated lumber. Instead, focus on non-pressure treated lumber. But what that means for if you're using reclaimed wood is odds are you are going to have to replace those boards fairly regularly because non-pressure treated lumber rots pretty quickly. With that said, there are varieties like cedar that's naturally rot resistant, But if you are trying to find that reclaimed, it's a lot harder. And also, if you're trying to buy that new, it can be really expensive. Actually, just as expensive as doing those metal beds that we discussed. So consider reclaimed wood. Go on Craigslist, go on Marketplace, go to, any kind of you could truly go to Home Depot, etc. Find those boards that are bent and bowed. See if they'll give you a discount. You can make it work. Remember, raised bed gardening does not have to be super perfect, especially when we're talking about trying to keep things cheap. So find some reclaimed wood and consider using that. Basically, the two expenses you're going to have with raised bed gardening is filling the bed and constructing the bed. And reclaimed wood is a really economical way. You could also use upcycled cinder blocks. I've seen a lot of this. I've also seen a lot of people literally buying cinder blocks to build their raised beds. And I'm like, what are you doing? They're literally putting them 5 cinder blocks high. And I'm like, at this point, you're not building a raised bed. What you are building is a retaining wall. And you are doing civil engineering. Do you realize what you're doing? And I think that's a little overkill and a little excessive. And personally, I find that to be a little wasteful. So even if it's not that expensive, and I don't think cinder blocks are historically horribly expensive, but I still don't think it's the cheapest option or the best route. If you want to use them, use them. I would really strongly encourage you to try and find some reclaimed ones on Facebook Marketplace, or dig around your property, dig around construction sites. Well, actually, please dig around construction sites with permission, right? We're not out here stealing cinder blocks. I am not advocating you stealing cinder blocks to keep on budget, but you know what I mean. There are a lot of cool things people have done with cinder blocks in their raised bed gardens. A lot of them will use the little holes in the cinder blocks to create fun little strawberry pots, etc. So cinder blocks can be a great option, really, really easy to construct as well. Now this one is a different one. All right, so a lot of these so far, and by a lot of these I mean the only two options I presented, focused on using reclaimed and upcycled materials. But this one is a really interesting way of doing a raised bed in general. Consider straw bed gardening. Now, I haven't done a ton of this, but basically the premise is you buy straw beds, not straw beds, straw bales. And straw is actually pretty economical as well. And basically you let these bales just kind of chill outside, and they kind of start decaying and rotting. And then you add a small layer of compost substrate into the straw bed just on top, and then you can plant a lot of different plants right into the straw. Now, this type of garden method does not do it you're not going to have this for a century, right? It will rot down pretty quick, and then you probably have to do it year after year. But I really like the idea of this because it can be pretty economical. It can get you a nice, good, solid height on a raised bed. It can help retain moisture. I just think it's a really innovative idea. So I definitely would say try that if you're interested in that. I think straw bale gardening is so dang cool. And I guess that's probably a whole nother episode, but I wanted to throw it out there because that is a raised bed garden. It doesn't have the traditional border like reclaimed wood or a center block exterior, but it is raised, it's elevated, so definitely worth a shot. Now, if you're not interested in all that mess, you can do truly the simplest method. And that is just go out into the woods, find a woodlot, someone who has some trees, and just cut some large, thick branches or trunks, about 6 inches to 8 inches in diameter, and use those as the border of your raised bed. It's truly that simple. You can absolutely use logs. Now, something I would strongly caution is that when you're using dead logs like this, and when you're using reclaimed wood that's not pressure treated, you do open yourself up to a little fun little friend called termites. So something you want to maybe stay on top of, make sure your home is treated for that so that you're not causing massive amounts of termite damage just so you can grow a lettuce plant. But But I do think it can be done, and I do it all the time. And granted, I have had some mild termite issues on the property in one of my garages, but if you stay on top of it and treat it, you should be fine to have a couple wooden reclaimed pieces in your garden. And then last but not least, let's talk about maybe using repurposed old containers. So I've seen a lot of people do this. They can take like bathtubs. Bathtubs are my favorite because I like when people use like those really neon color ones from the 50s. Like, give me the bright green, give me the bright pink. I'll take a yellow tub and then put some plants in it. I think that's so much fun. Now, I harped about the chemicals from pressure-treated lumber. I'm not going to deep dive into the chemicals from a 50s themed pink bathtub. Do your own research on that. But I do think it could be fun. I've also seen where people do cattle troughs and other things like that to create raised bed gardens. Basically, raised bed gardens are like just gigantic container gardens, right? So you want to have a little more space than just using a standard pot, but recycling old containers like bathtubs and stock tanks, I think that's a really great option, especially if you find them around. If you already have a farm, you might well find one of those lying around, or I feel like you can pick them up on Marketplace and Craigslist a lot of times for pretty darn cheap. Now, if you've figured out the structure of your raised bed, what you're going to do, I think the next big step is, how do I fill it? And this is probably the step that most people underestimate. So they've budgeted and they're like, oh, I can get these 7 metal raised beds. No big deal. Boop, 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 boop. Buy them, purchase them. Yay, I'm going to be a raised bed garden master. Seriously, gotta stop singing. But let me tell you, I really should try opera. No, raised bed gardening. So filling it is what really catches people off guard, because they're like, well, how expensive can dirt be? Oh my goodness gracious, geez. Dirt is not cheap, all right? Not cheap, my friends. So I don't think I have spent, I don't think I've filled a single raised bed that I have with just plain old dirt. Not one, because it gets so expensive. A lot of these will take a couple, cubic yards, depending on the size of your bed. So if you're trying to fill these, you might have to have someone dump a couple cubic yards of topsoil and garden soil in your yard, or you're going to buy bags and they just add up and you're buying hundreds and hundreds of dollars of soil. And you might reason like, you know what, it's fine. I'm just going to invest in some really good high quality soil for these garden beds. And I think that's great and fine and all, but I just want to remind you that soil quality does deplete as your plants use nutrients. Theoretically, you would be adding nutrients back, and as plants, decay, etc., the soil could get richer. But let's be real, if you're not managing that raised bed very well, the soil is going to get worse and worse and worse. So these are a few ways I like to fill my garden beds. These are highly controversial, so I'm just going to kind of prattle them off. One, first and foremost, with sticks, with leaves, literally with any kind of yard litter I can. So think grass clippings, think sticks, think leaves, just pile them in there. Truly, pile them. My favorite way to do this is I like to establish my garden beds in fall. So when the leaves fall off the trees, I live in an area where trees are deciduous, so all the leaves just drop. So we take those dropped leaves and I will fill the beds with sticks and leaves. And basically what that does is those will slowly decay over the winter months. And then once spring hits, you'll see that literally they've decayed down to about half of what they were. And at that point, I will take and add in my garden mix and potting soil. So that really can cut down your cost of each raised bed substantially by like over half. And that leaf litter is going to make for a really loamy, robust soil that I think is going to do really, really well for your vegetables. You can do so much with this. You can literally use grass clippings. You can use compost that you've made in your own garden. There's a lot you can do. I have goats on the property and cows. So I clean out the goat barn, and the bottom layer of my raised beds is hay, which typically I wouldn't be like, oh, put hay in your raised bed, because guess what? Hay packs loads of seeds, and then those seeds make loads of grass, and then the loads of grass makes it hard to weed, and then there's just a whole big weed, seed, hay thing, and you don't want that in your garden. But what I end up doing is I take the bottom layer, and I will take all the poop, yes, lots of poop. Let me tell you, those goats, they be pooping like crazy. All the hay, and then I fill it up about halfway. Remember, my raised beds are about 17 inches deep, so about half of that is the hay, the poop, all that yummy jazz. And then from there, I just fill in with soil on top, and it saves me so much money to do it this way. I would highly recommend considering doing that. Don't just simply go out and order a ton of topsoil and expect it to do wonders. And also, if you're ordering topsoil, a lot of times the topsoil is absolutely tragic. It becomes very hard. It can be very compacted. It is not usually the best quality soil. And I think another great hack for this is, I guess there's two approaches. One, you could spend a lot of money on great quality soil, or two, you could spend a lot less on kind of lower quality soil. So I tend to err towards the lower quality soil, and what I do is I use my compost from my garden here. I use the livestock breakdown from the poop and manure and the hay that is turning into compost, and I add lots of rich matter into the lower quality soil. And that first year, those beds are not thriving. They are just kind of scraping by. But as time goes on and everything starts to really break down and work together, I find that I have really strong and really healthy garden beds without spending a whole ton of money. So in that first year, consider planting crops that aren't going to need as much in terms of nutrition. So there are a lot of different plants that are lighter feeders, a lot of different plants that are heavier feeders. Consider planting plants that are lighter feeders in those beds, or you could even be more strategic about it. You know, you have legumes. Legumes do tend to feed pretty heavy, but they can fixate nitrogen into the soil. So if you're strategic about what you're planting, where you're planting, how you're doing it, I think you can get away with a little bit of that lower quality soil, and making sure you're adding in amendments throughout the season and as you can afford them. And you can end up growing a wonderful bumper crop, a beautiful harvest of plants using raised bed gardens. Now, last thing I want to talk about here is I've just spent an entire podcast episode hyping up raised bed gardens. I love them. I think they are the way to go. Like I said, they're easy on my body, they're cutesy, and they are really good for improved drainage and make it really easy to have good high quality soil and grow beautiful vegetables. I also think raised bed gardens tend to do better with that square foot gardening method, so you can really cram plants into a really tight and small space. But what I want to say is I grew up in the South. Not quite the deep South, but as close as you can get to deep South without being in the deep South. So I am a Tennessee born and bred child, and we gardened and farmed out of necessity. And I think that's what makes me want to bring this podcast to everyone. We had to do it because that's what fed our family. I was one of four, and my dad was the only person who worked. He didn't make much. Literally, at one time, he was making $6 an hour feeding a family of four and a wife. It just was not working for us. So we grew food to make sure that we had full bellies. And that's something I always had as a kid. It didn't matter if we had no money, we always had a full belly. And the way that we did that was gardening. And we didn't have the budget for raised beds like this. We did that old school, took a tractor. It wasn't even our tractor, it was a friend's tractor, and just plowed into the earth. And we did massive rows. We'd have massive rows of green beans, massive rows of corn. And I used to get so sick of picking green beans. I'd be like, I'm tired of this, Grandpa. And but that's what we would do. And that's how we fed our family. So let me just say, There is nothing wrong, and I mean nothing wrong, if you can't afford it. And let me say, I'm a no-till person, so I'm not a big fan of tilling. But if you can't afford raised beds like this, you can literally go out in your yard and garden straight in the ground. If you have garden space, if you have a yard space, if you have a patch of earth, odds are you can maybe cultivate that ground and start gardening. Raised beds are definitely a luxury. They're in right now, but you do not have to have those to be a successful gardener that grows a lot of food. So if it's just not in the budget right now, and if it's just not, something you have time for right now, don't worry about it. Don't do it. Just literally grow straight in the ground. Loads of people do it. And I still think that is a really positive step in the right direction, okay? And another great point is raised beds literally just means that the soil level is raised, right? So a lot of people create their own raised beds right in the earth. So they till a patch of earth and then they use a shoveling method. So basically they shovel over into the row and then they come from the other side and shovel over into the row. And what they're left with is rows that are about, 2 feet wide, sometimes 3 feet wide, but are 6 to 8 inches higher than the surrounding ground around them. So they do have that better drainage that comes with raised bed gardening, and those roots are a lot happier to be in there. They can stay a lot cooler. They can really benefit a lot from doing this. So you can do it without having reclaimed wood, without having cinder blocks, without using those straw bales. There are loads of ways you can do it. So don't let yourself get discouraged by seeing all those Pinterest posts and you're like, I can't afford this. I don't have the bandwidth to do this right now in my budget. You can garden without raised bed gardening if that's what you want to do. And if you do want to do raised bed gardening, that's completely fine. Consider using reclaimed wood, upcycled cinder blocks. You could even use just logs from your property or a friend's property. Consider straw bale raised beds, or even use repurposed old containers. And then when you're filling them, be sure and try and fill them with as much organic matter and material like grass clippings and hay and leaves and sticks as possible, so that you're not having to spend loads and loads on compost and garden soil. So I hope you found this helpful. If you're new into raised bed gardening, I really hope this gives you some framework on what you can do. Definitely, I would encourage you to do your own research as always, but I do hope this episode brought a little bit of light into your life on how to grow in raised beds a little bit more cheaply. But before you leave, I'm going to ask for a little tiny favor, especially if you made it all the way to the end of this, because let's be honest, I kind of got bored myself a few times. Maybe I'll start doing more opera. But before you go, if you could leave us some comment, tell us about your favorite budget hacks or what you love to do in your garden to save money. And definitely consider sharing this show with a friend who might need to benefit from this, or who not need, but could benefit from this. And leave us a review. Ideally, a nice, happy, kind review. But if I'm boring and a troll, then maybe just don't say anything at all. That would be wonderful. But until next time, I love all of you guys. Let's get growing together. Let's, again, build our farms, homesteads, and gardens without destroying our finances. Until next time, signing off. I'll see you guys.